Mm. So, great, thank you. So for those of you joining us for the first time today, the Alliance, the Eastern Africa Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance, is comprised of 7 countries in the Eastern Africa region. This is Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Burundi, Rwanda, and Sudan. And the main work of the Alliance is to ensure that countries in the region are taking part in long-term market activities, as well as supporting these countries to access climate finance for the implementation of their NDCs. So a lot of our work includes capacity building, and this also includes in the areas of potentially transitioning activities under the CDM into Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We also work a lot with government negotiators in promoting well-coordinated negotiating skills at an international level in areas of Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. And lastly, we do a lot of regional collaboration with partners on our shared goals. So for today, we have collaborated with UNEP FI, which is UNEP, the financial initiative. And I will give the floor to Ruben Wamboi, who is the Africa Regional Coordinator, to also give us some welcome remarks. Ruben, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bianca, and welcome to you all to today's webinar on climate finance. And as we look at demystifying it and its implications for the continent in the era of NDC implementation, as Bianca has mentioned, I work with UNEP-FI. I'm the Africa Regional Coordinator, and within UNEP-FI, we are the partnership between the UN and the finance industry, which consists of your banks and insurers and investors. We are the home to the principles for responsible banking and the principles for sustainable insurance. And in doing this, we are working with the private sector across the continent and also in other regions to see how best to tackle the issue of climate change and also to respond to priorities around the issues of sustainability. Just to give you a sense of our membership, the membership of UNEP-FI represents 25% of all global insurance premium for the insurance sector and a third of all banking assets. And with our principles for responsible investment, we are home to at least half of the world's institutional investors who've signed up to the principles. I think this topic today is very important and very significant, at least coming in the backdrop of the Africa COVID climate emergency leaders dialogue, which has been happening this week, hosted by the Africa Development Bank and the Global Center on Adaptation, which one of our panelists from the bank might talk to shortly. And just saying this is the first time we are having a recession in the last 25 years as a continent. It's very interesting times as we look at issues to do with climate adaptation, given that we estimate we've already had a 3% of decline in GDP, and the cost due to adaptation could rise the impact to up to $50 billion by 2040, and that is in Africa alone. So it's definitely clear that climate change poses a big risk to the continent as far as adaptation is concerned, and also on the area of mitigation. So I'm gonna stop it at that and give it back to Bianca, who's gonna take us through the moderation of the panel. Thanks, Bianca.
Thank you very much, Ruben. And I think you've really highlighted the impacts that are going to be faced. And just as a bit of a background, as we've seen from today's title, we'll be exploring 2 topics, climate finance and carbon finance, both of which are very wide, but we'll be taking more of a back to basics approach. We realize that the audience is quite varied. So the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015 and it came into operation in 2020. And we know that nationally determined contributions are being implemented by countries to achieve the aim of the Paris Agreement, which is in keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So a very common feature of NDCs in Africa is the requirement of accessing significant portions of international finance to implement them. And this creates a huge role for climate finance. priority for these countries tends to be in adaptation, just as Ruben has mentioned, which has often received less financing than mitigation activities. And because financing is needed in both adaptation and mitigation, innovative financial instruments are required to bridge this gap. So on one hand, we have Africa participating in carbon market activities under Kyoto Protocol. However, the benefits in terms of issuance and sustainable development were quite low, and when compared to other countries. And now, on this other hand, we have a new opportunity to take part in the Paris Agreement and to use Article 6, the new mechanisms and new approaches under it, in order to implement our NDCs as well. So Article 6 generally sets a stage for new market mechanisms that not only lower greenhouse gas emissions, but ensure environmental integrity and sustainable development. So countries have expressed both the need for climate finance and both have also expressed the want to use Article 6. So what we're going to do today is go through these two topics, and we have a very distinguished panel of speakers with us today who will take us through this. We'll start exploring it from the angle of what is carbon finance and how does it relate to the NDC. Then we'll have perspectives from the private sector, players who've been have been accessing carbon finance for some time. And then we'll look at financial institutions, the perspective from commercial banks and their role that they can play and the importance of analyzing climate risk. And then we'll also have the perspective from Multilateral Development Bank, AFDB, that plays a huge role on the African continent to give their perspectives as well on climate finance. And then lastly, we'll have a presentation from a country that has been working towards accessing climate finance and has used carbon markets in the past. So I'd like to welcome our speakers today. And our first speaker will be Fenella Aoun, who is the Deputy Director, Head of Carbon Pricing and Global Practice at the Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI. Our other speakers will be Patrick Colas, the Commercial and Operations Director at Climate Care, Madeleine Ronquest, who is the Head of Environmental, Social and Climate Risk at First Rand Group, Olofunso Somerin, who is the Regional Principal Officer of Climate Change and the Green Growth Program at the Africa Development Bank, and Peter Odhengo, who is a Senior Policy Advisor in Climate Finance and the Green Climate Fund, NDA, for the National Treasury in Kenya. So the speakers will tell you more about themselves. And our first speaker will be Fenella. You have the floor, and she can expand a lot more on her experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bianca. And I'd like to thank the East Africa Alliance and UNEP-FI and Ruben from UNEP-FI for inviting me to join this panel today. I think, I'm so sorry, someone seems to have left their line unmuted. I think we try and define the difference between climate finance and carbon finance to start with, because I think many people define these in different ways. So I don't, it's quite an individual thing, but we are developing quite a clear definition between the two of them. So if I kind of explain it the way I understand it, and then clearly we're open for discussion as to how others may define it. So within the overall view of green finance or sustainable finance, any funding, lending, transactional finance that is given to promote green growth, to promote emission reducing behavior. Within that, we define it into two areas. Climate finance is any form of lending or support, could be grant, could be equity, could be a guarantee, could be any form of supported funding that includes an element of overseas development aid. So some level of ODA originating from a government and then being disseminated through any number of channels. So it could be disseminated through an MDB, such as the African Development Bank, or it could be straight into commercial banks by supported lending, subsidized lending for green activities, or it could be given via NGOs, via grants. But the commonality between it is that it has some element of ODA. It is not commercial lending. There is then carbon finance, which is a different level of finance, which we are defining as transactional in nature. So here it is not a lending, it is whether you are trading an ounce of gold or a ton of aluminium, you are transacting a ton of, or the right to emit a ton of CO2 equivalent. So the obvious one, or the obvious point here is that the climate finance is more involved with public sector, or has an element of public sector. Clearly, it can motivate the private sector to act, but it has often some element of public sector. And I saw a quick question pop up in the Zoom there about, in the chat, about what about domestic climate finance? Well, this is true. You could have domestic climate finance by the government supporting, promoting good behavior, well, I say good behavior, green behavior, by offering a subsidy for solar water heaters, for example. That would be an element of climate finance. Then the transactional nature of carbon finance may be more orientated, not exclusively, but more orientated towards the private sector. So what we have is the resultant that we understand climate finance as being a finite pool, a finite resource. It cannot go on forever. ODA, there's only a certain amount of ODA or financing that governments is willing to give overseas. So this would be from generally understood, sometimes, but not always. It could be domestic, but it could be from the global north to the global south, if we're thinking about the Paris Agreement and the way finance flows in, for example, into and out of the GCF. Whereas the carbon finance is infinite. As long as there is a buyer and a seller of emission reductions, you can carry on transacting as long as you like, as we saw within the CDM of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, of course, within the CDM, what happened was that the buyers dried up. So the price then fell and you ended up with a market sadly collapsing. But providing we have continued increase in ambition, the thinking is that we will carry on getting an increase in buyers. So that's how we would define the two. Both are useful, but both must be used to their advantage. So with a finite pool, we must use climate finance very carefully. So the next thing I've been asked to talk about is how does this work in the aspect of the NDCs? So I think here we have to understand, what does it mean to partake in the carbon markets of the Paris Agreement and the Paris era? And I think the really important thing here to understand, which is the difference between the CDM and the Paris Agreement, as many who are participating already and talking about the Paris Agreement are aware of, is the aspect of corresponding adjustments. So in order to ensure that we really reduce emissions, one huge criticism of the CDM was that emission reductions were moved around the world, but no one actually overall reduced. So Europe bought emission reductions from Africa and China and Latin America, but then didn't actually reduce. They just bought from other countries. So the thinking now is that everybody must have their own share so a naturally determined contribution to reduce emissions. And if you decide to partake in a cooperative approach or transfer or trade as was known, then the thinking is that you should, therefore, you should make sure that that is not counted twice. So to ensure that it's not counted twice, you need to, if you take it out of the inventory and you transfer it to another country, you must add it back in again. So effectively, it's like double entry bookkeeping. But what that does mean is that you will have a risk that unless it is triggering increased ambition, you have a problem of it's not really designed to meet the NDC, it's designed to increase ambition and go beyond the NDC. Whereas the climate finance may be more suitable to be used to meet the NDC, as that does not require the corresponding adjustment. And I think just the last thing I want to cover is also we talk about Article 6 implementation. There are two areas where we can implement Article 6, and generally known as, or the two clauses that cover these areas, Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. Article 6.2 covers all international transfers. So if you wish to internationally transfer, you will use and utilize the guidance and rules of Article 6.2. Article 6.4 talks about effectively a replacement for the Clean Development Mechanism, many feel will be called the Sustainable Development Mechanism, the SDM. And that will be a top-down approach. It will have a supervisory body, likely be project-based and very similar to CDM. But what you can do in addition to that is Article 6 has left the door open to explore more national level schemes, which cover things like policy approaches, which is one of the areas that I and my team are looking at from GGGI in countries like Senegal and in Morocco. So lots more to talk about, but I shall stop there as Bianca has given me the wave that my 10 minutes is up. But happy to answer any of the questions. And just to conclude, just GGGI, for those who don't know, is an intergovernmental organization focusing on green growth. And we work on a membership basis, and actually within the East Africa Alliance, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Uganda are all members of GGGI. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manella, and that was right on time. Thank you for sticking to that. I know it was difficult, but it was such a good overview. For those of you who are not familiar, that was a really great overview, and I like that you highlighted that like the differences that are going to come up now that we have NDCs. There needs to be a lot more transparency. If you're going to be involved in trading, there needs to be corresponding adjustments. And I like that she talked about how Article 6 can be used to increase ambition, not just about implementing the NDC itself. It's about making it a lot more ambitious. I will give the floor to our next speaker, Patrick Coles from Climate Care, and then I'll follow up with two questions to both of them after Patrick. Patrick, you have the floor. Yes.
Good. Just a quick sound check.
You're good to go. Yes.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you, Ruben, for having me. Good day to all. I'm very glad to take part in this event and learn from a very capable panel. Climate Care has operated in and around climate finance, carbon finance for more than two decades now. We have the majority of our business involved in developing, managing and marketing carbon projects around the world. And we work with governments, with NGOs, with the public sector to deliver climate mitigation at scale using any mechanism made available to us. And we have overseen the successful implementation of dozens of projects in Africa over time across a variety of geographies and technologies. From our office here in Nairobi, which I manage. We also act as a climate policy, climate mitigation, and climate finance consultant for national and regional authorities, trade groups, and international agencies. And our vision for the private sector in this new world is really is twofold, and building on the distinction that Fenella just made. One that entails supporting the achievement of Paris goals and overall mitigation of global emissions by participating in non-market mechanisms and direct NDC implementation, that is in developing countries, typically in sub-Saharan Africa, participating in the dissemination of mitigation activities in targeted sectors and industries where private implementers can benefit from climate finance flows, which as described, from combination of public and private channels. So we do see and welcome vehicles originating and managed by
so well, if it's possible, why not? I think it was just
someone just arrived on the show. And vehicles like grant programs, like matched funding instruments, covered green bonds, and the like. Those are essential to unlock transformative capital in areas that are starved, really, of such resources in developing countries, and especially in areas with high abatement potential and high abatement costs. So most NDCs, and including all those in lower income and least developed countries, clearly highlight how essential this international support is by making their NDC target success conditional to international sources of income. And for instance, in cooperation and under the leadership of the government of Kenya and GIZ, our team at Climate Care last year supported the technical NDC update process for Kenya. And in doing so, after carrying analysis and assessment of mitigation potential, arrived at the conclusion that about 79% of the priority mitigation activities, their cost burden would be borne by international sources. Of course, some of this international support will be based on trading mechanisms like it, but the rest will rely on climate funds, sometimes with a focus on sectors like the land use sector, land use change, where trading eligibility might be reduced. And private actors like ourselves can claim those funds for project feasibility analysis and for project execution, and that is very welcome. And so the second part of our vision for the private sector is to support the achievement of the Paris goals by leveraging carbon finance and the market mechanisms themselves. So we have introduced Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It does enable carbon finance flows between parties and trading of mitigation outcomes, which is another source of revenue that the private sector can benefit from. We have been involved in early piloting of Article 6.2 international transfer of mitigation outcomes. And although this is not such a straightforward mechanism at the moment, because of course there's still uncertainty around the language of Article 6 itself, which has caused risk aversion and inertia, I would say, in the market, and also because most countries, to very recently, were still in the process of updating their NDCs, and of course could not feel entirely comfortable with the idea of giving away some of their emission reductions so early to other parties. But with that said, we have seen some goodwill working with governments in East and West Africa on Article 6.2 transactions over the past few months, having had open discussions around the current stage of the possible operationalization of these transactions, open conversations around the thorny issue of corresponding adjustments indeed. And we expect that this year and going forward, we will see the first purchase agreements for selected private sector-led initiatives in line with NDC recommendations that will secure carbon revenue for emission reductions all the way up to 2030. And this engagement and the recognition of potentially trading units, which will have to be discounted from NDC targets by host countries, is very important to encourage that. And as Canala mentioned, of course, we also have the SDM, so the CDM successor. We expect that once the rules of engagement for the SDM are agreed, potentially at COP, this can start driving mitigation action from the private sector if claim ownership is not restricted, which is still an option. And we can revert to early days CDM level of activity. But of course, I know that many keenly await COP and final text of Article 6, and we may get a text and final version, but we still may have to also grapple with measure of uncertainty with regard to its interpretation, which for some time thereafter may continue to discourage private sector participants. So the final avenue for the private sector to really engaged and aligned with the Paris Agreement is, of course, the voluntary carbon market. And the voluntary carbon market can enable gap financing from responsible private sector entities to help parties implement their NDCs and mitigate beyond their NDCs. There are also many contentious conversations about the accounting reconciliation of carbon and carbon units between the top level UNFCCC inventory management at the host country level and voluntary claims that could be made on emission reductions. We're not going to get to this or solve this problem now, but ultimately it will guide also how little or how quickly the voluntary carbon market can interact with NDC implementation as well through private mitigation activities. And for us and many others who have worked for many years developing and financing carbon projects in Africa using the voluntary carbon market, especially projects that can deliver much beyond environmental benefits and foster sustainable development in general, in the true spirit of the Paris Agreement. We do believe that there is ample demand side and supply side appetite, which can only really be harnessed by the private sector quickly enough for us to meet our climate goals. So as long as the principles of integrity and additionality are upheld, principles which we have stood by, we do believe that the national NDC implementation strategies that support a healthy voluntary carbon market can also be very, very beneficial. And so to finish, there is immense complexity in this new area of global NDC targets. And accounting rules and double counting worries will continue to be top of the agenda for some time. But we can imagine that with domestic and international climate finance funds focusing on core NDC targets and implementation, carbon finance can sort of step in and complement that to continue to create new paradigms, support creative and innovative technologies outside of NDCs even. And we can imagine that market mechanisms can create business incentives for the private sector that will stimulate climate action, even in cases where the NDCs themselves do lack ambition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Right on time. And thank you for highlighting all those important areas. As you've said, one way is to leverage more financing using this market instrument and taking part in the voluntary markets, which we've done, which a lot of countries in Africa have actually taken advantage of. So I just wanted to follow up very quickly in terms of the optimism that you're seeing within local private sector in your country. I know internationally there is a lot of demand that's coming up. And what advice would you give to the consultants who are here with us today in Africa? Because we've seen participation before in CDM, but how's the optimism moving forward? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, what would be very important going forward is that local consultants and local private actors remain close to authorities, or do rely on partners that will have the ability to engage with local and national governments, so that they can very early on clearly understand the rules of engagement for the activities that they will provide. So as we mentioned, the accounting issues will have to be taken care of in the text of the Paris Agreement. But then once you implement the NDCs and countries and national governments will have the ability to perhaps select which projects do get a corresponding adjustments, which projects do not. And this is a decision that will be on an ad hoc basis, or perhaps at a sector level. It will be important for local consultants to be aware of this, so that they can then design and target their commercial and financial strategy accordingly. So we do believe that private sector investment will focus a lot on lower income and developing countries, as it has in the past, because this is where you still get a lot of the main benefits beyond carbon from the project, and also where the costs of abatement remain lowest. But to achieve that, the private sector will also need to have the assurance that they can own the claim if it is a results-based finance mechanism, that they can, of course, clearly identify the impact in a robust and rigorous manner, and local consultants need to provide that assurance and mitigate the risk for those investors. So staying close to local authorities and have a good understanding of how flows can be disseminated will be very
important. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I think the local consultants can pick up on that. There's a lot going on in government, so stay close to them. I do have a very quick follow-up for Fenella, good, she's on. So I was wondering, because now we have different types of projects, and you can have the aspect of co-financing where you're receiving climate finance, which has the aspect of ODA. And what about carbon finance in the same project? How is that viewed? And you did talk about transparency and corresponding adjustments. Is it okay to have both, just as long as you're transparent, or what is your view on this? Should a project just have no aspect of markets at all, pure climate finance, or can you have both?
That's fine. A very good question, Bianca, and in fact it has a really clear answer. Is yeah, it can have as many different types of finance as you like. So very happily, the GCF climate finance can sit next to a carbon finance transaction related to exactly the same program. So in fact, that's what we're looking at on one of our transactions that we are putting in place in Nepal on biogas. So that is going to have some GCF funding, and it's also going to have some carbon finance. Now, there is one important difference between the CDM and the Paris Agreement when we're looking at co-funding or multiple streams of funding. And that is the aspect, what we call attribution. So what they say, what attribution is meaning is, well, if climate finance has supplied half of the money to make the project happen, then the carbon finance can't walk off with all the carbon credits because it's only funded half of the project. So it's effectively attribution is the sharing out of the funding between and the equivalent sharing out of the carbon credits. And this is being brought forward because they're effectively saying if And this is governments. At the moment, the only buyers in outside of the voluntary market, which Patrick has referred to quite extensively. So I make a distinction between that and what I would call the fully correspondingly adjusted compliance market. At the moment, it's only governments, because governments are the ones that are responsible for meeting NDCs or zero carbon targets as a nation. So the inventories that way. And it's the buyer governments who are saying, look, we can't, if we do a carbon transaction and take all the carbon credits, then effectively we've had some of those carbon credits subsidized by the climate finance. So this is why the aspect of attribution is coming in now. And I think one other thing, just to add to what Patrick said about, you know, staying close on for the local consultants, just the local consultants, stay close to what the government's goals are. What does the government want to achieve? Where does it want to go in its NDC? What sector does it want to go? And if you want carbon finance, what are the more difficult things to achieve? Because if you're trying to get carbon credits on wind in Kenya or solar home systems in Uganda, you may have a difficulty in that because they are often seen now as commercially viable. I leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We'll now move on to the finance section of today's session. And I'd like to invite Madeline. Madeline is Madeline Ronquest from First Round Group. Fantastic. Yes, you have the floor. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Today is a very exciting opportunity for me. I am in Johannesburg in South Africa, and I'm very excited to speak with some of my colleagues in East Africa. While I was preparing and thinking about what I would like to say, I was thinking that we probably have several issues and challenges that are very alike, whether you're in East Africa or Southern Africa. But the exciting thing is that we have equally as many opportunities, which is great. So as I said, I work for First Rand Group. It's a commercial bank. We have an investment or an asset management component as well as insurance. So it's a group of financial services, and we are located in Johannesburg. We do have a quite a large footprint in sub-Saharan Africa in 11 countries. And then we have a footprint in the UK as well. And so my role at First Rand Group is that I head up the section on environmental and social risk as well as climate risk. And we've been a long-standing member of UNIPIFI, and our membership there has been extremely beneficial to the work that I do in our group. We play a very active role in our industry participation, representing the finance sector as a whole, often nationally, but also sometimes as a representative of the continent. So I find these interventions extremely helpful to learn as many things as I possibly can. So just maybe just for interest's sake, to give you a background of what is happening in South Africa. You know, I think what we realize as a developing economy is that the impact of climate change is going to be most significant on a society that is already impoverished and where there's huge inequality, where some people don't even have access to electricity or running water. And therefore, we know that the least resilient will probably be the most affected. And there's a large focus in our country to look at a just transition. Unfortunately, we are on the top 20 countries that has the highest emissions globally. We're number 13. And the reason for that is that we have a very coal-based economy. I would say over 90% of our economy is based on coal. And we have this disconnect and this political issue around the availability of coal and the use of it. And, between different departments, so the Department of Environmental Affairs would set the updated NDC, but the Department of Energy will probably not be aligned with those plans. So we have that disconnect that we have to deal with all the time. And I think what we really want for our country is what all of us want, and that is economic transformation, job creation. So if we do transition out of certain industries like coal, that we do have a plan to create jobs in renewable energy. And so we have tasked ourselves through business industry forums to look at alternatives. And there are many. So the opportunities are there for ecosystem-based adaptation. It's there for renewable energy. It's there for green hydrogen. There's quite a large potential for us to even become an exporter of green hydrogen. And of course, we lucky, like all of us on this continent, is that we have an ample supply of sun. So solar and renewable energy is quite a nice solution for all of us. We don't have the problem that our colleagues in the European Union has, where the wind turbines and the solar panels snow over and then they're stuck without electricity. So we don't have that problem, fortunately. But all of this has to happen within a scenario of a just transition. So we have to make sure that we take the entire society along, and issues like extreme poverty, the issue like Ruben raised about the recession after COVID. Our economy has been severely struck by COVID as well. So we're also in the recession. Taking that into account and having to transition and create jobs is quite a challenge, but it is possible. And so South Africa's NDC has just come out, and it is an updated NDC from the first. And it sets a little bit more of an ambitious target than before. It's not quite where the climate scientists would like it to be. We don't think that everything is aligned for a net zero by 2050 for South Africa. And the way that we are going at the moment, we will probably overshoot that target by 10 or 20 years, which isn't great. Because as we all know, for Africa, if the warming potential is 2 degrees, it actually doubles up for Africa because of the way that global warming moves around the globe. And so we are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And this is why the urgency is quite high. So the South African NDCs have been updated, but they are once again very, very conditional and subject to funding coming from the GCF from wherever. So climate finance, really integrally part of us reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning out of fossil fuels. And then obviously also transfer of skills and technology. So for us, there's obviously opportunity. I'm very comfortable with the movement that we've had in our government. Our National Treasury Department last year issued a technical paper on sustainable finance. And initially the focus is very much on climate change mitigation and climate adaptation. And in this work, they have published a draft sustainable finance handbook. And this is really to help the financial markets look at the different possibilities, new markets, new finance mechanisms that they can use, and obviously also the registration of green bonds. In the same process, we have taken the EU taxonomy and we've adopted it for South Africa with small changes, obviously. And we intend to integrate transition assets like gas for an interim period of probably 10 years, so to be phased out by 2030, I think. And then we are fully implemented and supportive of the TCFD. So all of these things are aligning a path for us to focus not just on risk management, but also changing the outcome. And I would say when I was listening, before to vanilla, I was thinking, okay, so we are basically looking at it from various aspects. So climate finance, yes, being one, and we wouldn't have been able to do that without the support of DFIs like the World Bank, like AFDB, FMO, and others who have provided us with specific dedicated climate finance lines. And I'm delighted to hear that you can use it for carbon finance as well, as long as you make sure that you quantify attribution. That makes a lot of sense to me. We're doing a lot of research in terms of carbon markets. That is something that our clients are especially interested in, and looking at maybe facilitating trade as well as offsets, although I don't really like offsets unless you've done everything in your power to reduce your emissions. You know, and as Vanilla said as well, that's why the carbon markets imploded, basically, because, you know, we were basically just shifting carbon around the globe and not reducing our emissions. So that is one aspect, climate finance, which we use significantly. And then there's own capital as well. So private capital that we use, and what we are doing at the moment is we are pricing externalities so that we can actually cost capital at a price, at a premium, for using natural capital or having an impact on the environment or having an impact on climate. And that is work that we are doing at the moment, so that if we have capital going out to our business segments, they pay a premium for using that money for high emission activities, and they get a rebate when they use that for green or for climate finance. So that is work that we are doing at the moment. I must say a big difference is made when you have an enabling framework. So one of those that I can use as an example that worked particularly well for South Africa was the renewable energy and independent power producers framework, where there was a bidding process for renewable energy providers. There was offtake agreements, which would give the commercial banks the return on investment guarantee that we needed. And once the projects were approved, then the bank would finance that. And we have literally put billions of South African rands into these projects. But for that, we needed an enabling framework. And just in closing, I think it is true to say that we need to change the traditional ways in which our economy worked. We need to change the ways in which we finance. Traditional financing still has a place, but it needs to be by adjusted lending. And I think we need to relook and have banks risk sharing and blended finance, and carbon trading and so on. And so something else that we're looking at is green themed loans, KPI linked loans, green equity, climate change insurance, risk guarantees, blended finance, as I said, and then carbon trading, as I also alluded to. So this is a very exciting area for us. And I'm so glad that this is the object for discussion, or the subject, because a lot more climate finance is needed. And I would really like to see a lot of it coming towards our lovely continent. Thanks, Bianca.
Thank you so much. That was really, really rich. I did pick up a lot, and I like that you really highlighted there's a lot of potential, you know, in renewable energy, in nature-based solutions. And as a bank, it's quite impressive how you're looking. Sorry, there's someone speaking. You're looking at so many different areas. You're looking also into markets. You're looking at green bonds, and that you have to change the way we've traditionally looked at things. So my question was actually going to be like advice to smaller commercial banks, and I think you've given it a lot of the examples. So thank you very much for that. I would like to give it to Dr. Funso, who's also here with us today, to now give the perspective from a DFI, and then we'll bring both of you back afterwards. Welcome, Dr. Funso, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible now. Thank you again to the organizers of this conversation. And I call it conversation because I think we are having a lot of feedback from the audience listening to us, but also among the speakers ourselves. I think we're bringing new ideas. I think it's very good for the topic of today. I won't go deep into my introduction. I work for the African Development Bank. I'm based in Nairobi, and I cover the East African region over managing the bank's work on climate change and green growth in across 13 countries in the Eastern African region. I like to bring everybody's attention to the theme of this discussion today. And I think the key word in that theme is demystify. And I think it's very important to start first by expand the idea of what is really climate finance. And thank you very much, Fenella, for trying to step into that space to clarify. And I think from my own experience, from a very personal experience, there's a theory side of what the climate finance means, and there's a practice side. And oftentimes, the information or the idea that many people have tend to stem from the practice side, as opposed to what it means in theory. And I think if we have to go by the definition given by the UNFCCC, we're talking about entire, landscape that's looking at, multiple sources of climate, the source of this particular finance. And it could be from, private sources, public sources. It could also be from, different administrative layers, from local actors all the way to national actors, and even international actors as well. In most cases, when you talk to a lot of people, their understanding of climate finance is limited to accessing the external climate funds that are out there. The GCF, that's a Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and all the likes. And I think it's very important to understand that a lot of our governments in Africa are already doing climate finance. They may not call it climate finance, but if we go by the definition that any financial resource from multiple sources or single source that is going to actions that are consistent with either adaptation or mitigation, if we consider that to be climate finance, then we can also, we can definitely start from that point and appreciate the investment flow from government officials, from public sources, from private, even from individuals have gone into activities that are consistent with addressing climate change. And that means, and why that is very good, because it's very inclusive in its approach. It's also it makes it difficult in the accounting. And that's why it's very difficult to tell ourselves the exact amount of money that's gone into addressing climate change in Africa. Because the practice approach is how much is coming from developed countries. The practice approach is how much are we accessing from GCF. And I think it's very important because it's on the basis of this that an institution like African Development Bank considers itself as an actor in this whole landscape. And why do I say that? It's because we approach financing from multiple lines. So first and foremost, you must understand the notion of finance, climate finance, as a system. And it means that there are a lot of activities that you have to do that may not be monetary, but they have a role in facilitating the flow of finance to you. So it could be, and I think our last speaker, Madeleine, talked about the place of an enabling framework. So our job as a bank is first and foremost, look at a country or look at a region and understand what are those facilitative mechanisms that need to be in place for it to be able to increase its access to climate finance. So it could be in terms of institutional strength, it could be in terms of capacity development, particularly when it comes to building the bankable and investable proposals. But also it could be in terms of what kind of partnerships do they need to build? And I think that's a starting point for the bank. How do you support countries in the era of NDC implementation to build what are considered to be the foundation to be able to access finance? The second thing for us as well is even in our own operations, we look at how do we mainstream climate change in all our policies and all our operations. And that is very important because it's in that mainstreaming that it becomes easier for us to be able to design activities that are going to be consistent with climate funds. So let me give you an example. every year we break down all the activities in each project and put a cost to them to get a sense of what percentage of our total approval will be going to actions and activities that are consistent with climate change. It could be adaptation, it could be mitigation. So we call it climate finance tracking. And it's very important to know that for a bank like ours, on average, we approve about $10 billion a year. It could be, plus or minus $2 billion. And what that means is if you work with $10 billion a year, what percentage of that, of the bank's own resources, will be going to actions on the ground that are either adaptation or mitigation? So I'm happy to tell you that we've had a very positive shift. In 2016, it was barely 9% of our total approval. By 2019, 3 years later, we're talking about 4 times, 36%. Our goal is that by 2021, we want to reach 40%. So on average, we want to make sure that 40% of our total lending in every year goes to activities that are climate actions. So keep in mind, it could be adaptation, it could be mitigation. The second thing is the bank recognizes that adaptation will always be a priority for Africa. We are the most vulnerable continent. 7 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world are in Africa. And so we must place a priority on adaptation. And what we do, we try as much as possible to make sure that the bulk of the financing goes towards adaptation. So we've been able to achieve a bit of a parity between adaptation and mitigation. And what we tend to do is to scale that up, and through building the partnerships that are required to make that happen. One of them is what Ruben talked about at the beginning. And for some of you who participated at the Leaders Summit yesterday, looking into how do we scale up investment towards adaptation. That is the kind of partnership that is needed. But you see, within the whole range of it, you also look at some partnerships that are required in mobilizing innovative financing by working close with commercial institutions, financial institutions, through the Alliance of Financial Institutions for Climate Change in Africa. Again, as a bank, we're also interested in supporting our country in increasing the access to climate finance. So even those external funds that I talked about, the Green Climate Fund, we support many countries through our resources as either in form of technical assistance, supporting institutional strengthening systems to help them develop proposals that are able to access these funds. Lastly, and I'm sure I'm running out of time, I think it's very important to keep the attention on NDC implementation. So whether we're demystifying climate and carbon finance, and the goal is, and the question is towards what goal? And what that goal is NDC implementation. And NDC implementation is going to require a lot of partnership. And I think what the bank is doing very much is using its convening power to structure the partnership that we require to implement, to successfully implement NDC. So whether in form of our own projects, whether in leveraging our resources, or whether we're supporting government, it's a whole range of things. And I see Bianca's face telling me, keep quiet, you've got too much to say. But again, let me say this, final point. I want you to think about the concept of finance, money. And I think from my own personal experience, what we've learned is money moves in certain directions. So whether individual finance, corporate finance, whether national finance, it moves in 3 directions, So first is capacity. Money moves in the direction of capacity. So the more you build capacity in our country to be able to improve the climate rationale, to do a very vital assessment that needs to be done, or even develop proposals, there are chances that money will move in your direction. Secondly, money move in the direction of solvable problems. And I think the unfortunate thing is we're talking of a continent that is at the lowest base of development. So that base means that there's a way up. There are a lot of problems to be solved, and those problems are solvable opportunities for us. Lastly, money moves in the direction of partnership. You cannot do it alone, and those partnerships have to be within country, but also among countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a well-detailed explanation. I think now people have definitely seen climate finance and carbon finance in a different light. Thank you very much. They have a lot of comments are coming in, in the comment section, but I would like to move very quickly to our last speaker. We've finally been joined by Mr. Peter Odhengo. Yes, so apologies, there are no follow-ups. You've really exhausted it, but if there are any questions, I'd just like to remind everybody the chat box is still there. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box. So I'd like to invite Peter Odhengo, who I mentioned earlier is the NDA for the GCF in Kenya, and is here, good, yes, welcome Peter. Everyone is giving a further description of themselves. So we'd like to hear for what's been happening in Kenya, and the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Bianca, and the entire team. Sorry for these 10 minutes is not enough for what has been going in Kenya for the last 5-6 years. But let me just give a very highlight of what is happening in global perspective, and then I will come back to Africa and then briefly Kenya, where we'll spend about 5 more minutes. One, climate finance is the engine of the change that we want. Climate finance is the pillar and the fulcrum of all what we are talking about. Climate change has changed to be an emission and environmental pollution affair. It has now reached a developmental affair. And if you look at the trajectory of what is going on globally, it is about the money, as just the last speaker said, that moves the wheels. Within the Paris Agreement of 2015, one of the key things that was causing a lot of problems, and that what caused a lot of the delay in coming up to that agreement, was how do we ensure that sustainable, predictable, and scalable climate finance is flowing, particularly into the developing countries which are affected by climate change, like my country, Kenya here. How do we get that? And that one was very, very sensitive because nobody wants to pay. Nobody wants to avail it, but the developing countries want it. Within that, we have what we call the means of implementation. The means of implementation of climate global agenda and even the transition to low carbon emission and green economy is one, capacity building, as has been said. Without capacity, both human and institutional framework, even if the money is available, we are going nowhere. And it is key, and it is one of the key things that has made Kenya, Africa, and the region to be where we are, because climate-related issues are complex in nature. They are mathematical models that requires high-level thinking and concentration, which we lack in many perspectives. Number two, it is about technology and technology transfer. The key thing in reducing emission is about technology. And of course, I know you have been aware that emission comes mainly from the emission from the energy sector, land use, agriculture, forestry, etc. in the same. So as a result of that, technology transfer is very key. And to transfer technology, you need money, resources. And finally, you now need climate finance, which is that money which is dedicated over and above ODA or any development that is required. But let me now dig deeper on how did we do it in Kenya. Number one, far more before, as starting from 2009, when we developed our national climate change strategy, we had an assessment, a study, economic impact of economic assessment and study of climate change, which was done by the Stockholm Institute. And the Stockholm Institute estimated that Kenya will be losing between 2 to 3% of our GDP annually for the next 10 years. That is huge, and it really takes every economic growth that you have. Now, that study was a little bit more generalized, and as a result of that, it made a lot of proposals. That study was followed by what we called the development of the National Climate Change Action Plan, 2013 to 2018. That one was supposed to guide how Kenya is going to address this key critical issue, which became a national priority. But for us to realize that, a country like Kenya must have a very long-term vision and plan. You know, we have a Vision 2030, which was followed by our Big Four agenda. If you look at all the key sectors which are provided for within our National Climate Change Action Plan, the 7 sectors, tourism, agriculture, water, energy, climate change, land use planning, and etc., are very key in the driving of the economy and very sensitive to the climate change. But what is the challenges that we are facing with those ones? If you go through our MTP, medium-term expenditure framework, and if you go to the medium-term plans, which we have been doing 3, now we are in the 3rd one, just like the National Climate Change, they are all articulating, and we have already mainstreamed the climate change in all of them. But the key thing that drives the change and the climate change financing, all over the world is NDC. You are aware that we've just submitted our updated NDC, of which we now upped our ambition, although we were more ambitious in 2015 than we were today, because from 2015 we committed 30% reduction. But now we committed about 32% by 2030. Within those documents, Kenyan priorities, adaptation and resilient building, that is very clear, because we are only emitting 0.1% of the global greenhouse gas emission. But how do we mobilize finance? One, we need to know how much climate finance is coming into the country. And because of time, I would be able to give you a reference, and Bianca, I will give you a reference. Kenya, we started by knowing how much are we paying for our climate cost based on those studies. And we've just finished the landscape of climate finance in Kenya on the road to implementing our NDC, which is ambitious. And I think apart from a few countries in West Africa, which I've seen here, in climate finance, there is something which we call spaghetti. That spaghetti, we now have our own spaghetti. And this our own spaghetti, if you can see it, I don't know whether you can see this spaghetti. We now know what we got, where it came from, how much, where it went, and how it is moving. It is the latest report. These reports indicate to us that we've not done very well, but we've done quite good. That in 2017, 2018, we managed to mobilize $2.3 billion to be used within the key sectors that are affected by climate change. But unfortunately, and very good for the private sector, that more than 80% of that resources went into energy. Adaptation side only got 28%, which is very, very challenging. And as a result of that, based on this report, Kenya is now taking a very affirmative action to channel additional resources within the adaptation. And as a result of this, we are now working with the World Bank under financing locally led climate action, which is aimed at building climate resilience at the local level, village level. That is a program which is funded at the tune of $150 million from the World Bank. And also we are mobilizing additional $700 million. It's a $1 billion program. So the money is to be channeled towards adaptation, investment in adaptation, so that we can now devolve climate finance from the national centralized system to the local devolved system. And we are doing quietly, we are struggling with the design, but we are almost there. So I know Bianca will always now say that there is a problem. The timing is not good. It's not good for me. 10 minutes is not enough because it is a huge analysis. It is very good. It is available online, and I will share it with you. And Bianca has it. So in the final thing, we are also working on alternative finances. Kenya just finished our sovereign green bond. You can remember 2 years ago we issued this corporate green bond. We've just finished our national sovereign green bond framework, which has been approved. We have also got a second opinion from the CICERO, because those are very key to tap in alternative resources. So it is very key that when you want to move, first of all, capacity to develop bankable projects, you need policy and legislative framework that allows the partnership and also the financial to work with you. Then you also need to have governance structure, which is highly transparent, that can now mobilize that. And then the county's macroeconomic process within the county also must be correct, so that the private sector can have a confidence in you. Because climate finance now is a mix of private sector, equity, loans or debts, and also grants. And grants, even within the DCF system, grant is only accounting for less than 40%. So it means that huge amount of money in climate finance is moving from the debt. So we need to think differently and alternatively and start putting the structures in place to tap these market-based resources. Finally, we need to work on how we will be able to finance the long-term strategy. If we have to achieve well below 2 degrees Celsius up to 1.5, we need huge amount of money, annually $300 trillion per year up to 2050 if we have to do that. But public resources are not enough. We need private support, private sources to come so that they can support the government. We also need the skills, as has been said. We also need the governance structure, transparency and accountability. And finally, we have to track and we know how much climate finance we got from outside development partner, how much we got from the people's taxes, the public, how much we got from the philanthropists. We have done it. We are doing the second analysis. And now we know who are our partners. We know what they are put in. And this is what will definitely enable us to finance our updated NDC. And as a result of that NDC, which we submitted in December, of the $62 billion US, we already, by the end of this year, we're already putting up $1 billion. And a few minutes ago, we were discussing with the EU, which has already put in through their Green Deal for 7 years, 376 billion euros. And this one, the significant amount of this 376 billion euros is going to be used to drive emission downward. And finally, GCF has also committed to increase their commitments on adaptation from their portfolio of 11 billion US dollars, which they have mobilized during the second mobilization period towards adaptation. Colleagues, we must up our game and we have to do it well, and we rely on you. Africa must be protected, must adapt, must build resilience, because we have less emission reduced. Adaptation is key. We need to come up with models that can support Africa to adapt and also to build resilience. Thank you very much, colleagues. Do I have more time, Bianca?
No. But thank you so much. You have managed to cover so much in the given time, and we really appreciate it, because this is a real case, and we're seeing a real life situation unfolding for us, and a lot of countries can learn from this. So I like that you have very similar messaging, but now on a practical level, how adaptation financing is key. You have definitely talked about how working with local initiatives is really important. There has been a question that's come in on what are some of the barriers that you faced with local initiatives. But all in all, you've touched on bonds, green bonds, and then you've also touched on financing the LTS, which is something which not very many countries have started doing. So it's good that you've actually mentioned that. So we need to really think ahead. So I'd like to thank you for that. I think we do have some.
But just a second, just yes. Give me a chance, because yes. One thing which I've not mentioned, that as we are talking now, and which is going to remove the barriers for the private sector to support climate financing here. Mm-hmm. We are now we are finalizing our green fiscal incentive policy framework, which we are collaborating and being supported by your center. Mm-hmm. That policy framework is a very, very key tool that is enabling the private sector to come in and join. And that policy is going to be ready. We definitely need to have it and look at it jointly if we have. It is a door opener for the alternative, for attracting alternative sources of climate finance from the traditional one. And it will be a very key thing. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll definitely share the progress as we move along, but you're definitely right. This is policy that is going to make a big difference. And we don't have that much time, but I will open it up to just a few. Do we have any questions? I'm seeing a lot of comments, but I'm trying to look for a specific question. 1 second. So there's a question here directed to, wait, first at Peter. There was a question before on greening. I'll start in order. Give me 1 minute. So there was a question on what is the thin line between greening African countries and allowing them to produce reasonable carbon to speed their economic development. So I can open up that question to Madeline and to Fenella. Yeah, but I'll start with Madeline. And I think she touched a lot on this to do with just transition, but kindly go ahead. Yep.
Yes, I think the fact that we've been allowed to give NDCs where we are not overly ambitious and where it's conditional is based on the fact that developing economies obviously did not contribute to the problem that much to the problem that we have today. And so equitable and reasonable fair share for us to reduce by is less strict than it is for the developed economies, and that is true. But I don't think that that should hold us back. The urgency is there. The impact is going to be significant for our continent. So whether we have contributed to the problem as it stands at the moment or not is really, it's important, but it's not something that should stand in the way for us of taking action at the moment and straight away. Because of what I said before, the impact of global warming is double up for the African continent, and therefore many issues will be affected: water, food security, and so on. And those are issues that we simply cannot afford. Vanilla, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. I completely agree with you, Madeleine. Just transition and the fact that ambition is nationally determined, so countries are able to put their level of ambition at where they feel is appropriate. But I just want to point out one thing. We've recently, in the light of COVID, because recovery and economic growth have been really brought into sharp focus recently, and economies are needing to come out of slumps. I think it was Ruben who said earlier, Africa's in the recession for the first time in 25 years. We've recently completed a study at GGGI that shows that green recoveries, so promoting green energy, actually creates more jobs than going down what you would traditionally think of as the brown route. So in fact, the reason I raised to answer this question is because it is the essence of why GGGI exists, is to show you that you don't have to decouple economic growth from green growth. Green growth is economic growth in a green way. So it is not, it's not an exclusive, they're not mutually exclusive, is a really, really important point. So I would, whoever asked that question, I would really promote them to look at our website and the myriad of reports we have on there showing that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Fenella. We do have a question directed to Peter. We've had a lot about adaptation financing. So there's a question here. The adaptation measures in Kenya's NDC are ambitious. What about mitigating first? It's better to prevent the GHG emissions first instead of adapting after emissions are there. So what are your thoughts on that?
Great. Look, I said in my study, which I shared with you, that currently over the last 5 years or so, all the resources are directed towards mitigation. Mitigation is easy. It is linked with the bottom line for the companies, and everybody wants to go to energy, renewable energy. Now, the reason why Kenyans updated NDC is more pronounced on adaptation, that is where the problem is. In 2008, before 2010, there was a lot of challenges, and a lot of focus was being put on mitigation. That one was because the technologies that were green enough and were reducing emission then were more expensive compared to traditional coal, ETC, and firewood. So that made that the cost of mitigation there, but mitigating and getting the technology was higher at that point, and a lot of attention was pushed toward that. Today, most of this green tech now, if you look for the 1 megawatt of solar, In 2009, it was 2.5, more or less $2.4 million per megawatt. And that one was far way compared to hydro and coal. Today, all those costs are now at par. The reason why Kenya is now not focusing on that, because we are almost getting a solution. If you see, all counties are now saying they will be net zero by 2050. And if you look at Germany, and also you look at other countries, transport is already being we are going electrical at the highest pace if you look at Tesla and etc. So it means that a lot has gone into mitigation. But also remember that I said, Kenya is only emitting 0.01% of the global GSG emission. So it is not wise to dedicate significant resources towards 0.001 and then ignore this other sector where 50 million of Kenyans who are already struggling with the impact of climate change are not matched with that reduced emission. IPCC says that even if we reduce the carbon, if we reduce our emission to zero now, the impact will have to be there for the next 100 or more than 100 years. Now, the key thing now is to adapt and build the resilience for a warming temperature. And that is why we are directing significant resources towards adaptation and building resilience. This is in line with the outcome of the Adaptation Commission as commissioned by the UN Secretary General, where they want 60% of the global resources should now be rechanneled towards adaptation. So that is why we are moving with the global trajectory, and now we are building more resilience and adaptation at the local level. And that is why we are devolving climate finance to take that risk, to remove that risk from the people, as we are already moving towards a low carbon net zero by 2050.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. There is one more question I'll direct to you, but first we have a question going to Fenella. And I think this one can be just to remind the presenters to be brief in their responses. But there's a question on, are there any insights on potential CSA projects, I believe that's climate smart agriculture projects, that can generate carbon credits?
That's because I think you'll see there was someone somewhere else in the chat. Look, adaptation mitigation, major issue with adaptation is it doesn't reduce emissions. That's a problem with it, that's what mitigation does. So carbon finance pays for the tons of carbon reduced. So I was musing that the only thing I have found that has come up recently as an area is climate smart agriculture. Because with climate smart agriculture, you could look, for example, at solar irrigation. So that is helping to reduce emissions by taking away diesel powered irrigation, or is looking at more efficient ways to preserve water through drip irrigation or something. We were looking quite a bit in Mozambique at that, but are now looking in West African countries. So maybe that you're looking at supply chains. So perhaps chilled supply chains are very important. How to get your goods to market faster, especially where transportation is poor. You want to have these hubs of refrigeration, maybe, to get fish inland or other such activities. Resilient seeds don't reduce emissions, but maybe there are land-based. I say maybe because I'm not a land-based emission mitigation expert, but I am pretty sure that there are nature-based, land-based solutions that might be able to. But I would say whoever asked that question, go and Google the latest Bill Gates work. He has been doing a lot with a group called CIGAR, which is actually where our Director General used to run out of France, and they're a large group of nature-based solutions. They may help. I'll leave it there. I see Funso's got his hand up.
Yeah. So actually, I just, we have one last question, and I'll ask Funso also to chip in on that so that we can wrap up. Kindly bear with me, we'll just extend by 5 minutes. I hope that's okay with everybody. So I have a question here that's asking whether there are modalities in plans to track climate finance flows channeled to private sector and not-for-profit organizations. So I'd like to reference that to Funso and to Patrick, if they can just give their last views on this. And yes, then you have the floor, Funso. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bianca. And I think I like this conversation about the carbon market, because what happens in the carbon market is the unit of currency is carbon saved, tons of carbon saved. And I think the question out there is, can we extend the same thinking, the same analytical framework to adaptation benefits? So we move away from the notion that everything has to be, explained in terms of tons of carbon saved, to what about the environmental, social, economic benefits that come from adaptation? And I think the bank is trying to do that through the adaptation benefit mechanism. I'm going to put a link on the group chat for us, for everyone to go look at it. I think it's very innovative to start thinking about, is it possible in a way to create a market for adaptation benefits? If a bottling company depends on natural springs, and this natural spring is based on a functioning ecological productivity, ecological systems, by reducing deforestation, can we capture that benefit, put a cost to it, and try and create that value in the market? And that's what ABM, Adaptation Benefit Mechanism, is looking at. Second question, what can we do in terms of tracking financial flows, particularly involved by private sector? And the point to that is, you also know that there are many ways of looking at whether it's direct investment. And one of the work we're doing currently in this region is trying to see if we can work with commercial banks to help them as well to do this finance tracking I talked about. Can they look into their whole, investment lending over a period of time, and to see if a commercial bank is financing a 2 megawatt solar project or in an off-grid setting, that is definitely climate finance. For them, it's business as usual, because there's an element of profitability in it. If a commercial bank is financing a large-scale agricultural production that is using resources effectively, that is adaptation finance. And I think it involves that structure. So at a national level, if you have in a country like Kenya, where you have a system where even private players report through a register, then we can have an idea of how much investment is coming from the private sector. I'll keep it there. Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, in terms of mechanisms to track where finance is disseminated, private sector versus non-for-profit, that's probably a question for my fellow panelists to answer on the climate finance side. But clearly, I think it doesn't really matter too much. I think what matters is the availability of these flows for the private sector and for civil society, and we can see already so much being done coming from the developed world. We know that GCF is making a lot of money available. We know that we have the National Climate Initiative, small grants, and other mechanisms and other vehicles that allow the private sector to access funds. Now, it's sometimes very difficult for smaller stakeholders to find a forest with trees. It is sometimes difficult to have a good understanding of what it is that you can do to be eligible for these funds. And to begin with, where do you start? We work with large companies who have access to international funds, who have access to domestic funds, and Peter mentioned before a new facility in Kenya that will be made available, and that is very welcome. But for smaller smallholders and smaller stakeholders and profit, it is sometimes very difficult to understand what's out there. It is very difficult to track the availability of these funds unless you are looking into climate finance specifically, which is at times a niche of its own, which most of these people are not clearly comfortable with. So they have to go through intermediaries and consultants. So this in itself adds to their bottom line and to cost of accessing the funds. And sometimes the requirements that are attached to the funds and conditionality can be quite high, which of course can be demoralizing. So I think we're getting into a situation with, under the Paris Agreement, we have increased the amounts that are supposed to flow from the north to the south, and we welcome that. We want to make sure that the dissemination of these funds is transparent, the use of these funds is transparent, because the private sector will obviously need to have access to those and work in partnership with the public sector to implement the right projects. And tracking systems, to answer the question, will be needed exposed, but they also are needed ex ante to understand as a private investor and a private implementer, what do I need to do to access those? Who do I need to reach out to? Do I need to go to the Ministry of Environment? Do I need to go to a third party, domestic bank, international bank? It is sometimes quite complex, and clarity there will also definitely.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you for all the questions that have been coming in. There's been a lot of comments. And I'd like to ask Ruben to kindly come back on as we close. And I do, sorry, just 1 minute. Yes, I would like to really thank all our speakers today. Clearly, there's been a lot coming up, and we're seeing, particular areas that, participants are finding important and crucial to discuss. So this was the start of many conversations to come, and we really would like to thank all of you for staying with us till the very end. Ruben, do you have any last words?
Thanks a lot, Bianca, and thanks a lot, everyone. I think one thing I've particularly liked is the conversational tone of this webinar and all the exchange happening in the chat box. Clearly, where we are stopping at, we are not done with this discussion. And I think I'll just urge you to stay in touch with what the Alliance is doing, what Bianca is doing, with the Alliance, and what each of our speakers are doing with their respective organizations. And wherever we are, I can see different representation from the participant. Let's keep this conversation going and do this for the continent. So thanks, everyone, and it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.